トビデオ
When you think of an OVA, what genre usually pops into your head? It's usually the realm of the action genre, or the science fiction genre, or in some cases the horror genre, usually a lot of genres that involve lots of killing, maiming, and bloodlust. Shit that would not get past the censors and were made specifically for the home video market. But as we've seen on this show, while the above genres did encompass the vast majority of the format at one point, the OVA is home to pretty much all genres, and that includes the genre of comedy. The comedy OVA is an interesting sort. It's a comparatively small genre when compared to more intense works, but it also has a noticeable presence, mostly because it mixes well with the above genres. There's plenty of reasons why many anime studios chose to make an OVA a comedy anime back in the day. The numero uno reason, of course, being that it gave them the freedom to get off the leash and get completely rowdy with their humor in ways that would make a network censor choke on their own rage.
If that hand were to touch me in my most sensitive of spots, I'd lose control of my precious bodily fluids. Oh, if only my hand was my penis!
But another reason a studio could choose to make a comedy OVA is just because there's only really enough material available to make an hour-long anime out of it. It's entirely possible that you could theoretically stretch said materials over the course of 13, or if you're really daring, 26 episodes, but that runs the risk of having the punchlines lose their luster over time. A good example is Ultimate Teacher, a wild and crazy anime that has every gag thought possible crammed into it. Sight gags, mindless slapstick fights, humorous voices, and moments that, even without context, are weird enough that they are funny by default.
March! Jump, jump, jump! Swing, swing!
But imagine if that anime was stretched out over a couple of episodes instead of a 45-minute OVA. It would probably run out of steam real quick. Hell, even in the anime itself, by the final 10 minutes you can really tell that the jokes are beginning to run on empty as it makes a mad dash to the finish line. Sometimes in comedy, less is more, and when a comedic anime is short, sweet, and to the point, it can make for a memorable experience, such as today's anime. An evil organization has just phoned up the mayor of an unnamed prefecture out in the boonies. Calling themselves the Telephone Pole Group, they have announced their intention to take over the world starting with this unnamed countryside prefecture. Why this unnamed countryside prefecture, you ask? Ah yes, the Dr. Doofenshmirtz strategy. In response to this, the mayor decides to form a defense force. A Prefectural Earth Defense Force, as it were, which consists of 3 members of the local high school baseball team, pitcher Hiroaki Morita, power hitter Take Sugekubo, and coach/cheerleader Akiko Ikufube. It should be noted that they are the only members of the high school baseball team.
それから君たちには県から特別に防衛予算が出るそうじゃよ。防衛予算？わかりました。
No sooner has the team been formed and they have spent their allotted budget on some awesome tracksuits, they are immediately set upon by a squadron of Telephone Pole Group soldiers, led by the group's second in command and beautiful pink-haired firecracker, Lady Baradagi. Oh, and somewhere in the mix is a handsome foreign exchange student from India named Kamir Santin, who at the start of the anime was turned into a superpowered cyborg against his will by a doctor who wanted to live out his fantasy of creating the $6 million man. And no, that's not just me making a reference.
当たり前でしょうが、こうなったのもね、あなたの責任じゃないですか。おめえだって喜んでスチームウォッシーよりすげえの作るって言ったじゃねえか。私は言われた通りにしただけですよ。
1986's Prefectural Earth Defense Force is an underrated comedy classic of the 80s. It was definitely one of those titles that was getting shown at Cartoon Fantasy Organization meetings, but never really made that much of an impact to really tickle the interest of the streamlines and animegos that sprang up years later. And despite getting releases on VHS, Beta, Laserdisc, and the richest plum of all, VHD, for a while people thought this anime was lost. It had fallen that far into obscurity. It took ages for PEDF to get a DVD release thanks to some unspecified rights issues. ADV was only able to secure the rights for a sub-only DVD release as late as 2006, and even then they seemed kind of embarrassed it took that long. In those days, retro anime fandom was a niche subculture in an already niche subculture, so marketing either was completely non-existent or completely downplayed the whole product, essentially saying that this was a weird super Japanese anime only meant for the otaku, and that most anime fans would probably just prefer to save up for the next volume of Black Cat instead. So with that enthusiastic vote of confidence instilled, it is no wonder that Prefectural Earth Defense Force has become one of the many forgotten OVAs of the 80s out there. Kind of a raw deal for such a fun and funny anime.
俺が適当丸、こいつがいい加減丸だ。分離するとただのリヤカーと自転車になるという優れものだ。
確かにこれはどうでもいいぜ。
学校の備品をパクるのに苦労したがな。
Prefectural Earth Defense Force is, for real, a complete masterclass of how to do a parody anime right, while still kinda sorta paying tribute to the shows it's parodying. But you don't have to take my word for it. Okay, you actually do, you're watching my channel after all, but I'm gonna explain to you right here, right now, why Prefectural Earth Defense Force is so great. The Prefectural Earth Defense Force story begins with the manga of the same name. It is the most well-known work of mangaka Koichiro Yasunaga. It was never released stateside, but you can find the whole thing on archive.org with excellent quality, albeit untranslated scans. From what I can glean, it's a very lighthearted manga with an active art style that is defined by its extreme clean line work. My guess is that this was a deliberate choice to serve as a contrast to the grittier shonen titles that were running at the same time. The plot is mostly the same as the anime, but of course the OVA does cut a few things in the interest of time, such as muscular cross-dressing Americans, a team of psychics whose powers are limited only to vegetables, and a New Year's Eve themed villain whose power is a laser beam that can turn any group of people into a wild New Year's Eve party. The manga ran for a respectable 4 volumes between 1983 and 1985, more than enough success to justify the then booming OVA markets. Handling the OVA would be a production studio called Studio Gallop. While they are known nowadays as being the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime Factory, Gallop had just started producing anime at this time. Founded on December 13, 1978 by ex-Mushi animators, aren't they all? They were currently making a name for themselves by being the studio animating the smash hit baseball anime Touch, and filling in for DiC's co-production on The Littles after TMS had dropped out. Their resume on main production was still small at this time, but make no mistake, there was some experienced artistry at Gallop, and all of that shows up on the screen. I gotta say that I was pleasantly surprised by how impressively good the animation is in Prefectural Earth Defense Force. Usually when dealing with a comedy OVA of this era, you kind of expect things to be functional if modestly budgeted. But this is an anime that really cranks it up and dials it in as far as animation goes. The director for this anime was Keiji Hayakawa. Starting out as an assistant director, Hayakawa had studied under people like Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata back when they were doing work for Nippon Animation. This would lead him to make his directorial debut with the short-lived shoujo anime Isabelle of Paris, which is Prefectural Earth Defense Force's diametrical difference animation-wise. But after that came the titles in his resume that are more reflective of today's subject, with him storyboarding and directing episodes of Urusei Yatsura and Sherlock Hound, mostly the episodes that have strong boarding in areas of both action and physical comedy. Helping Hayakawa would be animation director and character designer Katsumi Aoshima. Another Urusei Yatsura alumnus, Aoshima is mostly known for her work on the Dragon Ball franchise, her trademark being her ability to animate heavily cinematic cuts that utilize dynamic camera angles, her most famous work being this shot from the Saiyan saga in Dragon Ball Z. So when the people heading up this project are people who have done or will go on to do impressive action and comedy animation, it's hardly a surprise why Prefectural Earth Defense Force looks so good. Take this scene for example. It's part of this chaotic chase scene where it has a ton of moving parts, tracking camera shots, a change in location, a series of quick impactful explosions, leading up to the coup de grace of the scene where the camera briefly follows Santine as he jumps through the roof and into the air high enough where we can no longer see him, until he comes crashing down with a dropkick. The camera tilts directly down to the roof as Santine crashes through it, before cutting to the exterior of the apartment complex where it blows up in a big fiery explosion. The scene is only 15 seconds, but so much visual flair is accomplished without losing any single detail. That attention to detail is what makes the animation so impressive throughout the anime. For example, so much consideration is given towards how much things weigh. You feel the weight of every object as they are crushing or being crushed by other objects, just like how you feel the heat of the fire of every explosion in this anime. It's a good thing that so much love, care, and passion was put into making the animation of Prefectural Earth Defense Force look so good as it does, because that is a key element as to why this anime is so funny in the first place. Because the genre has become so writer-driven in the past decade or so, there has been a school of thought that animated comedy is just one of those genres that you can completely cheap out on. As long as you execute the jokes correctly through some perfectly timed key posing, why even bother giving the animators more time on the in-betweens? But that thinking has always been flawed because animation is a visual medium, and since the beginning of the art form, animation has always been the primary vehicle to deliver gags. For instance, if you were to remove the great animation of Prefectural Earth Defense Force, you would end up losing what is supposed to be the overall main joke that is the through line throughout the anime, it being a parody of a science fiction tokusatsu series. Prefectural Earth Defense Force, the manga, was originally conceived as a gag-based parody series of the hit tokusatsu series Ultra 7. The third installment of the long-running Ultraman franchise, the plot of Ultra 7 is about a group called the Terrestrial Defense Force and their elite special forces unit called the Ultra Garrison, and they are aided by a mysterious foreigner whose true form is a powerful alien called Ultra 7. Obviously, it's not a straightforward parody, but the broad strokes are similar enough that Prefectural Earth Defense Force can be recognized as a parody of that kind of TV show. And what makes the anime an even better example of parody is that animation. Take the opening to the anime itself. It's a classic montage style opening of our three heroes doing larger than life feats, saving the universe and all that jazz. And right after the title goes up, it is revealed that it was all just a weird dream by one of the three mains. The joke is not just that the whole heroic deeds we see up front are a complete fabrication, or even that the opening song alludes to this by having the words science fiction be prominent in the chorus. But the amount of A-tier sakuga on display is a joke because it's all hinting at things that are not going to happen in the anime itself. Plus, and this is a very important point, taken out of context, it looks like a science fiction action anime played completely straight. Parody is, second only to satire, the most misused word in comedy. Usually when people describe a piece of media as a parody of something, they usually just mean that it's a straight example of something with a denser and wackier premise. Nothing is being lampooned or subverted. But with Prefectural Earth Defense Force, the way everything is shot and animated means that it does a good job of almost convincing you that this is a straightforward type show before the rug is pulled out from under you with a well-timed joke.
いい策でもあるのか。どうだこら、それか。残念だ。
But it's not just good animation that helps this anime be funny, because most of the cast are just funny characters in their own rights. What really elevates this anime is that there's no real character that can be considered the straight man. Sure, you have characters reacting to the surrounding shenanigans with a comedic expression of confusion, but in the grand design of Prefectural Earth Defense Force, everyone is kind of an idiot. Our heroes are idiots.
敵の意表をついて奇襲作戦でいく。服がよく乾く。
Our villains are idiots.
銀河一戦。 ホイット！いやー、眩しいわよ。もういや
The only character who could be considered the least idiot of the cast is Santin, and even then he's such an emotional hothead with a microscopic patience for the insanity surrounding him that he easily winds up being just another inmate in the asylum.
番茶をすすっとるんじゃよ。
番茶わしゃ梅昆布茶が好きじゃよ。
梅昆布茶。梅昆布茶が嫌いだ。僕はウーロン茶が好きだ。
And while I'm on the subject, Santin as a character surprised me with how they didn't make him being a guy from India his shtick. Other anime would have just made him a complete cartoonish cardboard cutout of his culture, and that would have just been his entire joke. A choice that would be hack and boring at best, and awkwardly racist at worst. Looking at you, Ultimate Teacher. But here, it's the total opposite, with the joke being on the ignorant Japanese, who immediately provoke his ire by subjecting him to some literally painful stereotypes.
せーの何をするんだいきなり。おかしいな。インド人はヨガやってるから大丈夫だと思ったんだがな。
Another thing that separates Prefectural Earth Defense Force from the pack is its formats. In its 50-minute runtime, the OVA is divided up into 3 episodes. The first setting up the overall premise, the second being an episode of our heroes trying and failing to sneak into the enemy base while Baradagi tries to seduce the Defense Force's chief benefactor / high school math teacher Mr. Roberi, and the third being an episode where Santin faces off against a high school girl named Yuko, who was also turned into a cyborg against her will. This allows for none of the mini episodes to overstay their welcome and helps keep the comedy snappy. I'm trying to imagine just taking one of these stories and stretching it out for over an hour, and it just fills me with dread. But beyond all the jokes about giant boxing gloves and abdomens, or our heroes being boiled alive for soup stock, therein also lies some subtle character-based humor. The character of Baradagi, being the sexy number 2 villain, easily could have just been a cackling baroness archetype with her own set of wacky jokes. But they actually portray her as more of a tired working stiff, the overworked secretary who's obviously trying to take it one day at a time and is up for any mission that involves her getting a free meal. It's a layer of good mundane humor that pairs nicely with her casually mentioning that her parents were Godzilla. However, in spite of the gags of this anime being incredibly well timed and executed on top of being very creative, Prefectural Earth Defense Force is not immune to hokey jokes. Like, it does have that old chestnut of the anime staff having their cake and eating it with a scene of Baradagi complaining how seduction is beneath her while simultaneously stripping down to her underwear in a very lovingly animated scene. Not complaining too much though, and while there's a lot of good character humor, the anime doesn't really get a lot of mileage out of Akiko, the sole female member of the Defense Force. It just feels like she completely vanishes after the start of the second episode, and we really don't get her running gag in the manga, which was her openly expressing her fetish for muscular thuggish men. Also, one of the final gags of this anime is this really weird one. Okay, so it turns out that Yuko's father is the same mad scientist who turned Santin into a cyborg, and also turned his own daughter into a cyborg simply because making people into cyborgs against their will was just too much fun. But in the end, because the two of them asked nicely, he decides to turn them back into humans. But in the process gives both of them a surprise sex change operation. I don't think this joke is transphobic, but it's such a weird gag to help close out your anime. It just feels like a weird gag for the sake of a weird gag. And judging from our heroes reacting to this by going, "This is stupid," and walking out of the room, I'd like to think some of the staff thought so too. Thankfully, the anime doesn't end on that bizarre note, and instead chooses to end on a sweet one. Morita and Baradagi meet each other on the streets, have a conversation, and decide that, since both of them are off the clock, decide to go on a casual date.
電柱組の就業時間はもうおしまいだろ？うん。じゃあ2人で飯でも食わんか？
ナンパのつもりか？田舎臭いな。
For a wild and wacky comedy, it's such a mellow way to end things. We even get to see Santin and Yuko being comfortable in their new genders at the end. Or maybe it was their gender all along. Trans rights? Trans rights. So, what's the final verdict on Prefectural Earth Defense Force? Frankly, I'd say it's on the upper end of underrated 80s comedy. On top of being beautifully animated, most of the gags work and have stood the test of time. No real awkward moments to be had from this anime. If I could compare it to a similar anime, it would have to be Project A-ko, which came out that same year. A smart, action-packed comedy that sells this absurd parody through gorgeously drawn animated set pieces. The difference here being that Project A-ko is this massive metropolitan-level blockbuster, and Prefectural Earth Defense Force is this small-town ode to destructive shenanigans. Which I guess is why this anime was underrated even in its day. It was completely overshadowed by another parody anime with a near identical premise that was just bigger in every way. And that's okay because it's just how things are. In the world of media, it's usually the one that makes the biggest splash that gets all the attention. But that doesn't mean we should also ignore Prefectural Earth Defense Force. It's the perfect companion piece to Project A-ko, with it being lighter and more humor focused. Plus you have a pink-haired cutie who likes to eat big meals front and center, and that's an automatic win in my book.
いいな、割り勘だぞ。感情は折半だぞ。